The music was a physical presence in the room, a relentless bass thrumming up through the soles of my shoes. The lights were a blaze of color strobing and swirling, catching the glitter on dresses, and the sweat on glasses creating a kind of beautiful dizziness. Everywhere I looked, people were laughing, their mouths wide open, heads thrown back, caught in a snapshot of pure joy. The air was thick with the smell of perfume and champagne, a sweet cloying scent that clung to the back of my throat. You know that specific sound of a successful party? It's not one sound, but 100 layered on top of each other, the rise and fall of a dozen conversations, the sharp burst of a joke, landing, the constant cheerful clinking of glass against glass. It all wrapped around me, this perfect shimmering illusion of happiness. And I was its chief architect, standing right in the center of my creation, playing my part to perfection. The smile was fixed on my face, a well-practiced curve of the lips, my head nodded at all the right moments. I offered empty compliments. And the craziest part, the part that made it all so surreal, was that the world didn't stop. The crowd kept laughing at some joke on the far side of the room. The music kept playing, a upbeat pop song with a mindless, cheerful beat. But the lights, they didn't feel festive anymore. The swirling colors that had seemed so joyful moments before now felt harsh and interrogating. They were no longer illuminating a celebration. They were exposing me, highlighting every flaw, every crack in the facade, pinning me to the spot. Rebuild my world, the will may be unbreakable, but it needs strong hands to shape reality, and mine were finally strong enough. The ground was gone, just gone. It happened slowly at first, almost politely, like the tide going out and taking the sand from under my feet, one grain at a time. A restructuring at the company, they called it a necessary downsizing. The title on the door, the salary, the corner office with the view I'd fought for 20 years to earn. It was all just vapor, an email, a brief awkward meeting with HR, and a cardboard box full of my personal effects. I remember standing in the parking lot holding that box, and looking back at the glass tower. It didn't feel like a betrayal, it felt like a magician had snapped his fingers, and the entire illusion just vanished. Then Anna left. She said it wasn't about the job. Not really, she said it was about the man I'd become, in pursuit of all that, the distracted, hollowed-out version of myself, who was always planning the next quarter, the next deal, but never the next weekend with her. She spoke softly, her words precise and final, like a surgeon making a clean incision. And just like that, the other anchor was cut loose. The house felt like a museum dedicated to a life that was over. Every object, every piece of furniture we'd chosen together was no longer a possession. It was a ghost, a reminder of a story that had reached its last page. So I sold it. I sold almost everything, the house, the car, the expensive watches. It was a frantic, almost violent attempt to shed the skin of the person I had been. I thought, if I could just get rid of the evidence, the pain would go with it. But it didn't. I moved into a small, anonymous apartment with a few boxes of books and clothes. And that's when the real freefall began, because when you strip away the job, the relationship, the things, what's left, I would lie on the floor of that empty apartment staring at the ceiling, and I would ask that question over and over. Who am I now, that I am not a vice president, not a husband, not a homeowner? The answers that came back were just echoes in a cavern. Nothing, you are nothing. It was the darkest period of my life, a long uninterrupted night that stretched for months. The despair wasn't dramatic. It was a heavy gray blanket that smothered every spark of motivation. Getting out of bed was a monumental achievement. The beliefs I'd built my life on, that hard work guarantees security, that love is a permanent contract, that things signify success, were all exposed as flimsy constructs. They couldn't withstand the slightest pressure. I felt like I was watching the world through a thick pane of glass. I could see people living their lives, driving to work, laughing in cafes, but I was completely separate from it all, untethered, a ghost ship, drifting in a silent sea. There came a point where the striving just stopped. The frantic energy to find a new job, to date, to rebuild the fortress of my life just ran out. I was exhausted. It was a complete and total surrender, not a graceful one, not a spiritual choice, but a collapse. I stopped trying to fix it, I just gave up. And in that giving up, a strange quiet began to descend. The internal chatter, the self-recrimination, the panic about the future, it didn't stop. But it lost its power. It was like I had been fighting under their blinding glare current my whole life, and I finally just let go and let it carry me. I started sitting in silence, just sitting. In the beginning it was agony. My mind was a chaotic storm of thoughts, regrets, and fears. I'd set a timer for 10 minutes, and it felt like an eternity. But I kept doing it, not because I expected enlightenment, But because I had nowhere else to be, nothing else to do, slowly, very slowly, I began to notice the spaces between the thoughts. I started to see that I wasn't the storm of my anxiety. I was the awareness watching the storm my thoughts and emotions became. Like clouds passing in the sky, some were dark and threatening, some were light and fleeting. But the sky itself, the vast open awareness, remained unchanged by whatever passed through it. I started taking long walks with no destination. I'd walk for hours through neighborhoods into parks along the river. I wasn't walking to get anywhere, I was just walking. And I started to really see things. I mean really see them, the intricate pattern of frost on a leaf. The way light filtered through the branches of an old oak tree, creating a shifting mosaic on the path. The sheer uncomplicated existence of a sparrow taking a dust bath. There was no meaning attached to these things, they weren't symbols, they just were. And in their simple being, there was a profound sense of peace. I began to journal, not to analyze or solve, but just to empty the contents of my mind onto the page, to acknowledge the pain without being consumed by it. It happened on one of those walks. It was an ordinary Tuesday, gray and cold. I was sitting on a bench, by the river, watching the water flow past. It was relentless, constant, powerful. And a thought arose. But it wasn't a thought from my mind. It came from somewhere deeper. The thought was, I am still here, the job is gone, Anna is gone, the house is gone. But the I that is aware of all this loss, that I has not been touched, it hasn't gone anywhere, it's more present than ever. It was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed. My identity wasn't in the things that were lost, my identity was this fundamental awareness that witnessed the losing. It was the canvas, not the painting, that had been scraped away. In that moment, the loss itself shifted. It stopped feeling like a punishment, a failure, a void. It started to feel like a necessary clearing, a forest fire that burns away the undergrowth, so that new seeds can see the sun. The attachment, the clinging, the frantic effort to build a permanent safe self, all of that had been the problem. The loss was the solution. It was the universe's brutal, merciful way of forcing me to let go of what was never truly mine to begin with. I felt a connection, then not to a person or a thing, but to the flow of the river itself, to the trees, to the sky, to the city humming in the distance. It was a connection to life, raw and unfiltered. I was a part of it, not separate from it. The boundary between me and the world began to feel porous, almost transparent. That glimmer didn't solve my practical problems. I still didn't have a job, I still lived in a small apartment. The ache of losing Anna was still a real thing in my chest. But the context for all of it had completely changed. The pain was no longer a sign that something was wrong with my life. It was just a sensation, a part of the human experience. I could hold it with a kind of tenderness. Instead of fighting it, I started to find moments of joy that were completely free of circumstance, the taste of a warm. After she said it, everything just stopped for me. The sounds around me became muffled and distant, like I was submerged in deep water. The vibrant colors of the Pardithe, reds, the blues, the golds, all smeared together into a meaningless blur. All I could hear was the frantic pounding rhythm of my own heartbeat, a deafening drumbeat of shame inside my skull. My first instinct was a surge of hot defensive anger. I wanted to fight back, to list my sacrifices, to explain my reasoning, to defend every cautious cup of tea, the feeling of the sun on my face, the sound of rain against the window. These weren't distractions from the pain, they coexisted with it. Life became richer, more textured, because I was no longer trying to edit out the difficult parts. Eventually, of course, life moved on. I found work, different work, simpler. It doesn't define me. I go to an office, I do my job, which is helpful to others. And I come home, the drive to climb, to accumulate, to be seen as important, it's just gone. It feels like a weight I carried for decades, that I finally put down. My value isn't out there anymore in a title or a bank statement. It's in here, in this quiet, steady awareness. I am more present with people. When I talk to the barista, I really see her. When a friend shares a problem, I don't immediately jump to solutions, I just listen. I can be with them in their experience, without needing to fix it, because I've learned to be with my own. I understand now that everything was never something to be built out in the world. It was always something to be realized within the peace. The security, the love I was searching for. I had been looking for it in all the wrong places. It was the seeker itself. This consciousness, this capacity to be aware, to experience, that is the only thing we ever truly have. And it is more than enough, it is everything. The journey through that darkness wasn't a detour from my life. It was the most important part of it. It burned away the false so that the real could emerge. I don't have all the answers, I still have bad days. But the ground I stand on now is different. It's not made of sand or status, it's an internal foundation. And it feels unshakable. The light I found wasn't at the end of the tunnel, it was in the darkness itself waiting to be seen. The silence in my apartment was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of the phone not ringing, of messages not arriving. It was the echo of a life that had been full of people, of noise. And then suddenly wasn't I'd walk from the kitchen to the living room, and the only thing I'd hear was the floor creaking under my own weight. I felt like a ghost haunting my own home. Every corner held a memory of a laugh that wasn't mine anymore, a conversation that had ended for good. The abandonment didn't happen all at once, it was a slow unraveling when my life took a turn they didn't approve of, when I stopped living according to the script they had written for me. The love I had always taken for granted just evaporated. It was conditional. And I had failed the conditions. The people I thought were my foundation, my family, my oldest friends, they just faded away. Their chairs at my table were empty, their voices were gone from my life. And the worst part was the realization that it had always been that fragile, that the connection was based on me performing a certain role, and the moment I stepped out of it, I was on my own. Facing challenges alone changes you. A flat tire isn't just an inconvenience anymore, it's a monumental problem. A bad day at work sits with you all evening, because there's no one to vent to, no one to offer a hug and tell you it will be okay. You start to feel like an island completely separate from the mainland. You see people laughing together on the street, families having dinner in restaurants, and this deep physical hunger for connection starts to ache inside you. It's not about being lonely in a decision to tell her she was young and didn't understand. I wanted to shout over her truth with my own version of events. Sentimental way. It's a primal need for a tribe, for people who see you, who know you, who would notice if you were gone. I was starving for it. The decision to try again, to risk connection, felt like the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. The idea of walking into a room full of strangers, of trying to make small talk, was terrifying. The fear of rejection was a constant whisper in my ear. What if they don't like me? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I end up feeling even more alone than I did in my silent apartment? I must have stood outside that community center a dozen times, my hand on the door handle, ready to turn around and go home. The courage it took to finally push that door open was the same kind of courage it takes to jump off a high dive. You just have to close your eyes and leap. The first events were awkward. I'd stand near the snack table, clutching a paper cup of punch, smiling too brightly at anyone who made eye contact. The conversations were surface level, the weather, work, whatever the event was about. I'd go home afterwards feeling drained, and honestly more isolated than ever. It felt like I was speaking a language no one else understood. But I kept forcing myself to go. I shifted my focus. Instead of going to these things, hoping to receive something, to find a friend, I started going with the intention of giving. I'd offer to help set up chairs. I'd listen, really listen, to what someone was saying instead of just waiting for my turn to talk. I'd ask a second question. I started showing up for people, for small things. If someone mentioned they were moving, I'd offer to carry boxes. It was easier to think about what I could offer than what I needed. And then something shifted. I started to see kindness in the smallest gestures. The woman from the book club who remembered I liked a certain author and brought me a book she thought I'd enjoy. The guy from the volunteer garden project who saw I was struggling to lift a bag of soil and came over to help without me asking. These little moments were like sparks in the darkness. They weren't grand declarations of friendship, but they were real. They were acts of seeing, of acknowledging another person's existence. It was surprising. Every single time I had built up so many walls to protect myself, and these small acts of decency started to find cracks in the mortar. Building a new family is a slow, deliberate process. It doesn't happen overnight. It's built brick by brick through consistency and small, vulnerable moments. It starts with showing up again and again. It's answering a text promptly, it's remembering a birthday, it's being the person who says I can come over when someone is having a hard time. And then it's about allowing yourself to be vulnerable in return. It's admitting that you're having a rough week. It's sharing a fear, a hope, a silly dream. That reciprocity is what builds trust. It's a silent agreement that says I see you and I am not going anywhere. You solidify these bonds by weathering small storms together. The time our community garden project got hit with a surprise hailstorm, and we all worked together to cover the tender plants. with tarps and buckets getting soaked and laughing hysterically, the time we all chipped in to help one of our group get their car fixed. When they were strapped for cash, it's not about the big dramatic rescues. It's about being in the trenches of everyday life with people. It's the shared struggle that makes you a team. But that impulse was instantly drowned by a tidal wave of shame, so profound it left me breathless. And with it came a terrible dawning realization. Cold and clear, my mind flashed back not to the big moments, but to the small quiet erosions, the time she wanted to study art. And I gently steered her toward business, framing it as being practical, the difficult conversation about her mother, that I had always found a reason to postpone. The countless moments I had chosen the path of least resistance. My tribe looks nothing like the family I was born into. We're different ages, we come from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, different careers. What unites us isn't a shared history or bloodline, it's a shared set of values: kindness, honesty, the belief that we're responsible for each other. We chose each other actively every day. And because it's a choice, the commitment feels deeper, more intentional. We created our own rituals, a monthly potluck dinner where everyone brings a dish, a yearly camping trip to the same state park. These traditions are the glue, they're the things we look forward to, the stories we tell again and again. They signify that we belong to something, to each other. The moment I truly understood that the circle was complete was my birthday. The previous year I had spent it alone, eating takeout and watching TV, trying to pretend it was just any other day. This year they organized a surprise party. It wasn't fancy, it was in my own apartment, which they had secretly decorated. But when I walked in, and everyone yelled surprise, I was just overwhelmed, looking around the room at all these faces, these people who had chosen to be here to celebrate me. I felt a sense of belonging so profound, it was almost dizzying. This was my family, we had built it from scratch, from the ground up. The security that comes with that is a different kind of wealth. It's the knowledge that if I lost my job, there would be people offering support, a couch to crash on, leads for new work. If I got sick, there would be people bringing soup and checking in. It's a safety net woven from care and loyalty. It's the opposite of that terrifying isolation I felt for so long now. My home is rarely silent. There's usually someone stopping by, or a group chat buzzing with messages. The silence has been replaced with the comfortable sounds of life shared. I understand now that family isn't a title you're born with, it's a title you earn, and that is earned for you through action, and love. Blood can make you related, but it doesn't make you family. Family are the people who show up, the ones who stay, the ones who see the real you, the messy, imperfect, complicated you, and don't just stick around, but embrace you for it. They are your mirror, your comfort, your challenge, and your shelter. The final wealth isn't measured in money or possessions, it's measured in the depth of your connections. It's the rich, warm, complicated tapestry of a community that values you simply for who you are. I went from being an island to being part of a continent, and I would never choose to be alone again. The collapse wasn't sudden, it was a slow-motion failure of every principle I had ever held as true. I had built my life on a set of ideas I considered unshakable, a career path that was supposed to be linear, and upward, financial strategies that were meant to compound into security, beliefs about relationships, about merit, about how the world worked. They were my operating system, and one by one they crashed. It wasn't an emotional realization. At first it was more like a forensic analysis. I was looking at the wreckage of my former life, a career that had evaporated, the savings that were gone, the relationships that had frayed, and I had to admit something terrifying: my knowledge had failed me. The very tools I had used to build my life were the reason it had fallen apart. The blueprints were flawed, the equations were wrong. The safe option, the silent nod, instead of the challenging question. I saw the slow, quiet erosion of her trust in me, layer by layer, year by year, until this fragile statue of a father she had built in her mind had completely crumbled. My hands holding my drink started to tremble so violently, I had to set the glass down on a nearby table for fear of dropping it. My throat tightened, making it impossible to speak even if I had known what to say. I just wanted the floor to open up. I wanted to. I had to confront the gaps, huge cavernous voids in my understanding. I thought I knew about money, but I only knew about earning it in a specific booming market. I didn't understand value or inflation or risk management. I thought I knew about psychology, but only the pop culture version that tells you to think positively. I had no framework for real resilience, for coping with genuine loss, and systems. I had navigated systems my whole life, but I never understood their underlying mechanics. I was just a passenger who thought he was the pilot. The moment of admission was the most humbling point of my life. It wasn't about feeling sorry for myself. It was a cold, clinical admission of ignorance. I was not the expert I thought I was. My mind was a library filled with books that had proven to be fiction, and that admission, that stark acknowledgement of my own intellectual bankruptcy, became the most powerful catalyst I had ever experienced. It was the first step. I decided then that if my old knowledge was the cause of the ruin, then new knowledge would be the foundation of the rebuild. I would treat my life as a research project. I would become a full-time student of loss, of recovery, of reinvention. So I enrolled in the only university available to me, the world itself. My tuition was time and attention. I became a voracious consumer of information. But with a purpose. This wasn't about casual learning. This was a targeted, systematic acquisition of wisdom. I needed a new operating system, and I had to build it from the ground up. I started with philosophy, not the dense academic kind, but the practical wisdom of the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius and Seneca became my daily companions. They taught me about focusing only on what I could control, about enduring hardship without being broken by it. Then I moved to economics. But this time, I studied the principles, not just the headlines. I read about behavioral economics, about how cognitive biases lead to terrible decisions. I was reading about myself. I was the case study. History became a crucial text. I stopped reading about kings and battles and started studying periods of collapse and renewal, the Great Depression, the rebuilding after wars. I was looking for patterns for the human responses to systemic failure. Science, particularly evolutionary biology and complex systems, gave me a new metaphor. Life wasn't a ladder, it was an ecosystem. Failure wasn't an end point, it was a form of data, a necessary feedback loop for adaptation. My classroom was everywhere. Free online courses from universities I could never afford to attend became my lectures. Podcasts by economists, psychologists, and historians were my seminar. Discussions during long walks. Documentaries became visual textbooks. I sought out mentors not in person, but through their life's work. I read biographies and letters, studying how other people had navigated their own catastrophes. I was building a personal board of directors composed of the greatest minds across centuries, all accessible through the pages of a book or a digital file. The most critical shift was in how I analyzed my own failure. I stopped treating it as a personal moral flaw that was a dead end. Instead, I treated it as a data point, a very large, very significant data point. I became an archaeologist of my own collapse. I laid out the evidence of my bad decisions and asked not why was I so stupid, but what false assumption was I operating under here? What was the flawed logic? What was the missing piece of information? This analytical distance was my salvation. Disappear into the noise, and the crowd to become just another anonymous guest at this terrible party. And I understood with a cruel, intimate clarity that felt like a physical wound, that her anger, it wasn't really anger, it was just a reflection, a perfect, painful mirror of a deep, lingering hurt that I had caused, and then ignored for years. It was the echo of my own cowardice, returned to me in her trembling voice. It transformed shame into curiosity. It turned regret into a problem-solving exercise. But theory is useless without application. Knowledge that sits on a shelf is just decoration. The real work began when I started to design a new life using these first principles. As my foundation, I had to move from being a student to being an engineer. I started small. I didn't try to rebuild my entire life in one go. That was the old grandiose thinking. I created a new budgeting system, based on the economic principles I'd learned, focusing on antifragility, rather than just growth. I tested it for a month. It felt awkward, restrictive. But it worked. It gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. Then I worked on communication. I had identified that my old style was defensive and closed off. I studied nonviolent communication and started applying it in small, safe interactions with a barista, with a colleague. I'd try a new way of phrasing a request, and I'd observe the result. Did it lead to a better outcome? Did it reduce conflict? I adopted the scientific method for life design. I would form a hypothesis based on my reading. For example, if I wake up 2 hours earlier and use that time for deep work and planning, my productivity and sense of agency will increase. Then I would run an experiment for a set period, say 2 weeks. I would collect data on my mood, my output, my stress levels. Then I would analyze the results. Did it work? Did it need modification? If it failed, it wasn't a personal failure, it was just a failed experiment. I'd learn from it and try something else. The goal was to build systems, not just achieve goals. A goal is a point you reach. A system is a process you follow regardless of the outcome. I built systems for my health, for my finances, for my learning habits that were robust, that could withstand shocks. The idea was to create a life that didn't just survive setbacks, but could potentially gain from them. An antifragile life. This was the complete opposite of the brittle, high-risk structure I had lived in before. Over time, the pieces started to fit together. The philosophy gave me the emotional stability to handle the uncertainty of the experiments. The economics gave me the framework to build solid financial systems. The historical perspective gave me the patience to understand that rebuilding is a slow process. I was no longer just reacting to life, I was designing it. I became the architect of a new existence. The confidence that emerged from this process was fundamentally different from the confidence I had before. The old confidence was brittle, built on a foundation of luck and unexamined assumptions. It was the confidence of a gambler on a winning streak. This new confidence was quiet, it was deep. It came from understanding the mechanics, from knowing that my plans were based on proven principles, not on hope. I had stress-tested my new beliefs. I had evidence that they worked. She didn't say anything else, she just looked at me, her expression a mixture of immense sadness and finality. She had said all she needed to say. She turned a simple, decisive movement and walked away, weaving through the crowd without a backward glance. And the space she left behind was so silent, so profoundly empty, that not even the blaring music could ever hope to fill it. It was a vacuum, a void, where our relationship had stood just moments before. The life I have now is not the same as the one I lost. It is superior in every way that matters. It is more resilient. When a problem arises, I don't panic. I see it as a systems check. I have a framework for diagnosing it and a toolkit for addressing it. It is more fulfilling because it is a life of continuous growth and understanding, not just accumulation. It is more intelligent because it is built on a foundation of curated knowledge, not inherited dogma. And perhaps the most surprising outcome is the desire to share this knowledge, not out of a sense of superiority, but out of a sense of utility. I see others struggling with the same bankrupt ideas I once held. And I want to say, there is another way. You don't have to start from scratch. You can stand on the shoulders of giants who have already figured a lot of this out. The knowledge feels like a common good that should be shared. The final profound realization is that the greatest asset I built through this entire ordeal was not a new bank account or a new career. Though those things did come, the greatest asset is my mind. It is no longer a closed system, resistant to new information. It is an adaptable learning machine. I learned how to learn. I learned how to unlearn. The period of loss was the tuition I paid for an education I could never have received any other way. It taught me that reinvention isn't about starting over, it's about upgrading your understanding, and once you know how to do that, you are in a sense bankrupt-proof. Because even if you lose everything else, you still have the one tool that can build it all back again, better than before. You want to know the secret to building an empire? It's not a secret at all, it's a story written in ashes, my story. And the most important chapter is the one that starts with me having absolutely nothing less than nothing, really a negative balance in every conceivable way. I remember the day the ground was truly burned. It wasn't a dramatic single event, it was a slow, suffocating series of disappointments. The final partnership agreement, the one I thought would be my salvation, fell through not with a bang, but with a politely worded email. The investors I'd spent 6 months courting decided my vision was too risky. My so-called partners, the ones I'd built the initial concept with, they looked at the empty bank account, and they walked away one by one. They took their safe jobs back, their comfortable lives, and they left me with the debt. They left me with the legal obligations of a dying company. They left me with the shattered pieces of an idea that I still believed in with every fiber of my being. And in that moment, standing in the empty office, we could no longer afford, surrounded by silent phones and unpaid invoices. I didn't see an end. I saw a clean slate, a brutally, painfully clean slate. It was terrifying. But it was also pure. There were no more compromises to make, no more opinions to consider. The canvas was blank. And for the first time, I was the only one holding the brush. The problems I faced were immediate and crushing. How was I going to pay my rent? How was I going to eat? But beneath those survival questions were the core problems that had plagued the old business, the inefficiencies, the lack of a true connection with the inducer, the bloated software that tried to be everything to everyone, and ended up being nothing to anyone. I had lived through the crisis. I had felt the friction points firsthand, and I realized with a clarity that was almost violent that other people must be feeling this same friction. If I could solve my own desperate problems, I could solve theirs too. I just stood there utterly frozen, a statue of regret, under a glittering disco ball that spun mindlessly on scattering points of light. Across my motionless form, people brushed past me, jostling my shoulders. But I didn't feel it. I was trapped in that moment of impact. And in that absolute stillness, the final understanding settled over me. The cowardice wasn't just about the things I hadn't done, the risks I hadn't taken. It was about my fundamental refusal, a refusal to face love honestly in all. The motivation wasn't some elegant inspirational quote. It was raw. It was a fire in my gut. It was a fierce burning determination to prove every single person wrong. The investor who said I was a bad bet, the partner who said the idea was flawed, the friend who gently suggested I should just get a job. That anger, that energy, it became my primary capital. It was the fuel that would burn when I had no money for coffee. It was the drive that kept me coding until 4 a.m. after a full day of waiting tables. The pain of being left with nothing was no longer a wound. I was learning to wield it as a tool. I was channeling it, that feeling of having everything taken away. It became the relentless engine that could not be shut off. So I started in my garage. Actually, it was a studio apartment, so small the kitchen table was my desk, my dining room, and my bed. Bootstrapping isn't a romantic word when you're living it. It's the smell of instant noodles and the constant anxiety of checking your bank balance. There was no funding, there was no safety net, there was only sweat equity, my own sweat, my own time, my own stubborn. The first version of the product wasn't even an MVP in the traditional sense. It was a patchwork of code, a kludge of solutions built around the one core problem I knew I could solve. I used every free tool available. I taught myself skills I never thought I'd need. I wasn't building a company, I was building a life raft, and I was building it with scrap wood and sheer force of will. The hustle became my entire business model. I did things that absolutely do not scale. I personally onboarded every single one of my first 10 customers. I'd get on the phone with them at midnight their time, if that's when they were free. I'd handhold them through every step. I'd customize features for their specific needs, writing code specifically for them. I wasn't just selling a product, I was selling a partnership. I was selling my own commitment. They weren't clients, they were collaborators. And had come from nothing, because I understood their pain points on a visceral level. I could speak their language, I could anticipate their problems before they even arose. And you know what? The constraints were my greatest gift. Having no money forced extreme creativity. I couldn't afford a marketing agency, so I wrote every blog post myself. I couldn't afford ads, so I spent hours on forums providing genuine helpful advice, without ever pushing my product. I became a part of the community. I was trying to serve. The scarcity bred a kind of innovation that a well-funded startup could never replicate. We weren't trying to invent the next big thing, we were just trying to survive, and in that struggle we found a better way of doing things. The tipping point didn't feel like a tipping point. At first it felt like another day of grinding. It was an email from a small business owner on the other side of the country. She had found one of my forum posts, tried the rudimentary version of the software, and it had saved her 50 hours of manual work in a month. She didn't just want to buy it, she wanted to talk to me. She had ideas. She became my first major client. But more than that, she became my first evangelist. She told her friends, and they told their friends. It's difficult demanding truth, to be brave enough for the hard conversations, the messy emotions, the vulnerable admissions. I had chosen the clean, quiet lie of a happy family over the complicated, beautiful truth of a real one. That was the moment the business became sustainable. It was the first month I didn't have to put my personal grocery money into the server costs. It was the first profit. It was a tiny number, but it was black ink instead of red. It was proof that the fuel from the ashes was real. Then came the hard part, growth. I couldn't do it alone anymore. I needed a team, but I couldn't offer competitive salaries. I couldn't offer stability. All I could offer was the vision. I had to find believers. I looked for people who had their own fire, their own reasons for wanting to build something meaningful. I shared the story of the burned ground. I shared the mission. I was brutally honest about the challenges. And slowly, incredibly, people started to say yes. They took pay cuts. They left secure jobs. They bet on us because they believed in the why. Scaling was a whole new kind of terror. The systems that worked for 10 customers broke under 100. The processes I had done manually became a nightmare at 1,000. We had to build structure. Without losing the soul, we had to create playbooks and documentation. But we had to keep the creative problem-solving spirit alive. It was a constant balancing act. The most important rule we instituted was one I learned from the garage: stay close to the customer, no matter how big we got. Every engineer, every designer had to talk directly to a user at least once a month. We could not lose touch with the core mission, the mission that was born from my own struggle to solve a real painful problem. And now we have what people call an empire. But that word feels wrong. It implies conquest. This feels more like a community, a platform. The business is not just a source of income, it's a legacy. It's a testament to the idea that your lowest point can be the foundation of your highest achievement. The most profound satisfaction isn't the financial freedom, though that is nice. It's the ability to create opportunities. We have an internship program, specifically for people who are where I was talented, driven. But starting with nothing, we look for hunger, not pedigrees. We fund small initiatives that solve real-world problems, not just ones that promise a massive return. We use this platform, this thing we built from nothing, to lift others up, because I remember what it felt like to have no one reach down. When I look back at the journey from that empty office to where we are today, the feeling isn't pride exactly. It's a quiet, deep sense of understanding. The victory isn't the valuation or the market share. The ultimate victory is that what I have built cannot be taken away. It can't be taken away because it wasn't built with someone else's money or on someone else's terms. It was forged in resilience. It was tempered in the fire of failure. The empire is made of bricks that I formed from the ashes myself. And that foundation, that fuel, it never runs out. And accepted hollow ones in return. I was performing the role of the good parent, the proud father, the man who had built this wonderful celebration for his wonderful daughter. The disguise felt seamless. My last sight was of her silhouette framed by the bright lights of the doorway. As she left the room, she wasn't an accuser anymore in that moment. She was just someone who had finally unburdened herself. Someone finally free enough to speak her truth, leaving the weight of it behind for me to carry. The music began to fade, the party, starting its slow wind-down. And beneath its dying rhythm, a strange, painful acceptance began to grow. This wound, this raw, open gash she had left, was agonizing, but it was honest. And for the first time, I understood that the pain of an honest wound might be the only thing that could ever truly begin to heal us. The day the money vanished wasn't a loud day. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the wood cold under my elbows. The laptop screen glowed, a little square of false hope in the dim morning light. I clicked refresh one more time, a habit, a nervous tick. The numbers loaded. And my stomach dropped. It wasn't just low, it was zero, a flat, absolute zero. The savings account we'd painstakingly built for years, the checking account for groceries, for the mortgage payment due next week, all of it just gone. My first thought was a mistake, a system error. I logged out, logged back, and my fingers clumsy on the keys. The same zero stared back, a hollow digital void. Then the panic started, a cold trickle at the base of my spine. I checked the transaction history, and there it was, a single massive transfer to an account I didn't recognize, initiated by him, my business partner, my friend, the one who was supposed to be building this future with me. The betrayal was so complete, so total, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I couldn't breathe. The silence in the house was deafening. It was the silence of everything we'd worked for evaporating in an instant. The emotional toll wasn't a single feeling, it was a carousel of horrors. First, the sheer, unadulterated panic, heart hammering against my ribs. A frantic, bird-like, fluttering my vision started to tunnel, focusing on that terrible, unwavering zero. Then the despair, a heavy physical weight, settling on my shoulders, pushing me down into the chair. What were we going to do? The mortgage, the car payment, the credit card bills stacked on the counter. The simple act of buying milk for the kids felt like an impossible mountain to climb, and under it all a slow-burning anger, a rage so deep and quiet it scared me. How could he, after all those late nights, all the shared dreams, the handshake agreements built on trust? It felt like a part of my own history had been rewritten into a lie. But the most paralyzing thing was the fear of the future. It was a blank, terrifying page. I looked around the kitchen at the home wed maid, and all I could see was a countdown timer to eviction, to repossession, to a kind of failure I never imagined possible. I just sat there for what felt like hours, trapped in that chair, watching the sun rise and illuminate a world that had fundamentally, catastrophically changed. Assessing the damage was a brutal, necessary surgery. I had to look at the numbers without flinching. I got a notepad, a cheap spiral-bound one, and I started writing assets zero, literally zero. The bank accounts were empty, our retirement funds had been tied up in the business, and they were gone too. The house had equity, but that was a long, complicated process to access. And we needed money now. Liabilities, a mountain, the mortgage, 2 car loans, tens of thousands in credit card debt from when we were trying. I saw her then across the crowded room, my daughter. She was standing near the large window that looked out over the city, the skyline twinkling behind her like a scatter of fallen stars. She wore a deep blue dress that seemed to catch every shifting hue from the lights, making her look almost ethereal, radiant. That was the word everyone used. And for a moment I let myself believe it. But then I saw the distance in her eyes. They were scanning the room, but not really seeing anyone. Her laughter, when it came, was to keep the business afloat. I added it all up. The final number was so large it felt abstract, like a national debt. Not something a single person could ever tackle. We had no safety net, no rich relatives to call, no secret stash. We were starting from absolute, undeniable zero. And that's when the pivotal decision happened. It wasn't a loud, dramatic moment. It was a quiet click inside my head. I was sitting there surrounded by these pieces of paper that spelled out our ruin. And I had a choice. I could give up. I could let the despair win. I could call the bank, declare bankruptcy, let them take the house, and just collapse. Or I could fight the anger. I felt that burning ember. I focused it. I channeled it. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about my integrity, my family's future. I made a promise to myself right there, at that cold kitchen table. I would not let this break us. I would rebuild from nothing. I would crawl out of this hole, even if it took me the rest of my life. That decision, that simple, fierce refusal to quit, was the first real asset I created. The first 90 days were pure survival mode. It was a triage situation, like in an emergency room. You stop the bleeding first, shelter and food. That was the only goal. The immediate threat was the mortgage. I called the bank. I explained the situation, my voice shaking. Humiliated, I begged for a forbearance, a payment plan, anything. They granted a temporary pause. But the interest would still accrue. It was a stay of execution, not a pardon for food. We got ruthless. The pantry became a sacred inventory. We ate things we'd forgotten. We had cans of soup from the back of the cupboard, bags of rice, frozen vegetables. I calculated the cost of every meal down to the penny. Luxuries vanished. No more coffee shops, no more takeout, no more anything that wasn't an absolute necessity. The mindset shift was the most important part of this phase. I had to embrace an extreme form of frugality. It wasn't about being cheap. It was about redefining what was essential. Essential was a roof over our heads. Essential was food in our stomachs. Everything else was noise. I sold anything that wasn't nailed down. Books, old electronics, jewelry I never wore. It felt degrading, haggling over $20 for a camera. But that $20 was gas in the car for a week. That $20 was a victory. Income generation was phase one. Pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. I took on multiple menial jobs. I delivered food in the evenings. I stocked shelves at a grocery store overnight on weekends. I did yard work for anyone who would pay me. The work was hard, physical, and often thankless. My body ached. I was constantly tired. But every single dollar was a brick I could use to start building a wall between my family and the abyss. I opened a new bank account at a different credit union, a tiny, defiant act of rebuilding trust. I created a barebones budget. It was a brutal document. Income on one side, a list of our most basic expenses on the other. There was no room for error. Every dollar had a job before it even arrived. And I started a debt repayment plan. The payments were laughably small at first, $10 here, $20 there. But the act of making the payment, of chipping away at the mountain, even with a teaspoon, was a psychological lifeline. It was action. It was momentum. Little too loud, a fraction of a second too late, a performance echoing my own. Every time I tried to catch her eye, to send a silent signal of shared understanding, she'd turn her head, engaging someone else in conversation, effectively building a wall between us. But then, for one fleeting second, As a slow song began to filter through the louder music, our eyes met across the expanse of the dance floor. It was a fragile connection. A thread stretched taut over the noise in her gaze. I saw a silent question, a deep. The grind was the next phase. After WED stabilized, the immediate freefall survival was secured. But we were still on the edge now. Was the time to build a foundation. I knew that menial jobs would only ever keep us afloat, they wouldn't get us ahead. I needed a marketable high-income skill. But I had no money for courses or school, so I used the library. I spent every free minute there. I devoured books on coding, on digital marketing, on graphic design. I used the library's computers to follow free online tutorials to practice, to build a portfolio from nothing. It was slow, frustrating work. I'd come home from a shift, unloading trucks, my back sore, and force myself to study for 2 hours before collapsing into bed. It felt like trying to fill a swimming pool with an eyedropper. My first entrepreneurial venture was born from this. I had learned basic website design. I started offering to build simple websites for small local businesses. I charged next to nothing at first, just enough to cover my time. My pitch was simple: I am reliable, I am cheap, and I care about your business. I did good work, I met deadlines, I communicated clearly. Slowly, through word of mouth, the work started to come in. A few $100s for a website, then a few hundred more. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I had created something from nothing. Reinvesting every spare dollar became a religion. Any profit from the side business, any extra cash from an overtime shift, didn't go towards a nice dinner or new clothes. It went right back into the business. I bought a better laptop so I could work faster. I invested in a proper software license. I put money into learning a more advanced skill. I also started putting tiny amounts into a separate savings account. The power of compounding, even with small amounts, is a magical thing. Watching that grow even by $50 a month gave me a sense of forward progress that was addictive. It was proof that the grind was working. Networking was just as important as the skill itself. I made a point of being reliable, of being the person who did what they said they would do. I joined online forums for freelancers. I asked questions. I helped other people. When I could, I built a reputation, not just as a guy who built websites, but as a guy you could count on. That reputation started to pay off. People began to refer clients to me. The work became more consistent, and I was able to slowly raise my rates. The breakthrough didn't happen with a bang. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was updating my budget spreadsheet, a ritual I performed every single week. Without fail, I entered the income from my main job, from the freelance work, from the various little side hustles. I tallied up the expenses: the mortgage, now back on a regular payment plan, the utilities, the groceries, the debt payments. And for the first time, the number at the bottom was positive, significantly positive. It wasn't a windfall, but it was a buffer. Cash flow finally surpassed expenses. We had breathing room. The constant gnawing anxiety in my gut loosened its grip. Just a little. I could take a full breath for the first time in years. That's when we moved into the strategic phase, securing everything. The first major goal was becoming debt-free. We attacked the debt with a new ferocity. We used the snowball method. We listed all our debts from smallest to largest regardless of interest rate. We focused all our extra cash on the smallest one, while making minimum payments on the rest. When that first small debt was gone, it was a massive psychological win. It felt like a real victory. We celebrated with a home-cooked meal, a real and weary uncertainty. I didn't have an answer. I just offered a weak, helpless smile. And the moment shattered. She looked away, and the wall was back thicker than before. Celebration this time, not a guilty luxury. Then we rolled that payment into the next smallest debt. The momentum built with each debt cleared. Our monthly cash flow increased, giving us even more power to attack the next one. The day we made the final payment on the last credit card was quiet. There were no fireworks. I just printed out the confirmation page, stared at it, and felt a profound, deep silence. The weight was gone. We were free. Then and only then did we start seriously investing for the future. We moved from saving to building assets. We opened a proper investment account. We started small with low-cost index funds. We learned about diversification. This wasn't about getting rich quick. It was about slow, steady, boring growth. It was about building a fortress so strong that no single event could ever knock it down again. We increased our retirement contributions. We started a college fund for the kids. We were no longer just preventing disaster. We were constructing a future. The new definition of wealth, the one I live by now, has nothing to do with fancy cars or big houses. Wealth is security. It's knowing that if the car breaks down, it's an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. It's having options. It's the ability to say no to a bad deal, to walk away from a toxic situation. Because you have the financial backbone to support that decision. But most of all, wealth is peace of mind. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have built something solid, something real with your own two hands. It's the ability to sleep through the night, without the ghost of an empty bank account hovering over you. That peace, that quiet, unshakable certainty, is worth more than any amount of money that ever vanished from a screen on a quiet morning. It's the freedom I fought for, and it's the freedom I will never ever take for granted again. The old studio was quiet now, a different kind of quiet. Before, it was the quiet of waiting, of anticipation, the quiet before the storm of creation. I used to call it. Now it was just hollow. The big north-facing window was smudged, letting in a flat gray light. It fell on the empty easel, the dreed-out tubes of paint, the canvases stacked against the wall, facing inward, like they were ashamed. That was my life before my career, really. I was successful. I had the gallery shows, the write-ups in magazines, the right people saying the right things at the right parties. But it was all for them. Every brushstroke was a question. Is this what they expect? Is this the right shade of blue for the current trend? Does this composition look bold enough? But not too challenging. I was a master of the algorithm. Before algorithms were even a thing in art, I knew the formula. I could produce a painting that would get a nod of approval from a critic, a check from a collector. It was a performance, a very lucrative, very empty performance. The muse I followed wasn't some mythical goddess of inspiration. It was the ghost of marketability. It was the fear of being irrelevant. And I fed it, and it grew, and it completely drowned out any other voice inside me. Then came the loss. It wasn't one single event, more like a series of tremors, that finally brought the whole facade down. A relationship ending, a health scare, the death of someone I loved deeply. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me, and all those carefully arranged colors and shapes just shattered on the floor. And in the aftermath, the silence in this studio became absolute. The desire to pick up a brush was gone. It felt obscene almost to try and make something beautiful when everything felt. The trigger was so small, it was nothing really. A comment made in passing, a piece of casual parental advice, offered to a friend of hers who was standing nearby. I said something about the importance of stability, of making safe choices, of not risking everything on a dream. It was a platitude, a thoughtless reflex, something I'd said 100 times before. But I saw the effect immediately. Her whole body went still. The pleasant conversational mask she had been wearing just fell away, slipping from her face like so brutally ugly and broken. What was the point to decorate the void? I'd look at my old work, the pieces that had sold for so much money, and they looked like lies, pretty polished lies. They had nothing to do with the raw, aching reality I was now living in. I thought the spark was gone, not just dimmed, but extinguished, forever drowned in all that grief. This room, once my sanctuary, became a tomb for a version of myself I could no longer believe in. So I stopped. I just stopped. I didn't come in here for weeks. Then months. The dust settled on everything. I'd open the door sometimes just to feel the chill of the place. It was a wilderness, a period of forced silence that I had no choice but to endure. I wasn't an artist anymore. I was just a person grieving. And in that state, something strange began to happen. Because I'd given up on the idea of creating art, the pressure vanished. The inner critic, that voice that had always hissed, not good enough, not original enough, not sellable enough, it just shut off. There was nothing left for it to critique. I had hit bottom, and there was a weird freedom in that. I started to just be with the materials again, not as tools for a product, but just as things. I'd pick up a piece of charcoal and feel its weight, its grain. I'd run my fingers over a blank sheet of paper, not with the intention of marking it, but just to feel its texture. I'd go for long walks in the woods near my house, and I wasn't looking for landscapes to paint. I was just looking. I'd pick up a stone, a piece of bark with interesting moss on it, a feather. I'd bring them back and leave them on the workbench. They weren't references, they were just companions. And then, almost secretly, I started making little things, a tiny lopsided clay pot that collapsed in on itself in the kiln, a few lines scribbled in a notebook that I immediately hid away, a hummed melody that had no structure, just a feeling. This was art as a private diary. It was never meant for anyone's eyes but my own. It was messy, awkward, and completely without pretense. There was no audience. There was only the need to somehow give form to the formless ache inside me. I was forgetting how to make art the old way, and in that forgetting I was stumbling towards something else entirely. The first real mark happened on a day I don't even remember clearly. I was in the studio not to work. But to clean I was going to pack it all away. I think admit defeat. I had a can of cheap black paint. I was going to use to cover over some old canvases. But instead of painting over them, I just dipped my fingers in the can. It was cold and thick, and I pressed my hand flat onto a large sheet of primed board I had lying around. It wasn't a thought, it was an impulse, a raw physical gesture. I looked at the mark. It left the stark black imprint of my hand, with all its lines and whorls. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't trying to be anything. But it was honest. It was the first true thing I had made in years. That one gesture opened a floodgate, but it wasn't a chaotic flood. It was a slow, deliberate uncovering. I started painting again. But the aesthetic was completely new. It was rougher. I used my hands more than brushes. I mixed sand and dirt into the paint. The colors were muted, earthy, with sudden sharp bursts of a color I'd never used before, a deep bloody crimson, a bruised purple. The surfaces were textured, scarred. I started incorporating things I found on my walks, twisted roots, scraps of rusted, shattered glass. What was left underneath was raw, startlingly honest, and utterly terrifying. The noise of the party seemed to recede, pulling back like a wave, leaving just the two of us in a sudden, stark silence. Metal fragments of cloth. The themes that emerged weren't ones I chose. They arose from the materials themselves, from my hands. They were about memory, about what remains after a fire, about the quiet strength of something that is cracked, but not broken. It was less about building an image, and more about uncovering one that was already there, buried under layers of expectation. I built a new body of work, this way, piece by piece, driven by an internal necessity I hadn't felt since I was a child. It was organic, it felt like breathing. I wasn't trying to say anything to anyone, I was just listening, finally, to what needed to be said. Then came the hard part, integration. The work started to fill the studio again. But this time, the space felt alive, it felt like mine, and a thought began to form. What if I shared this? The fear was immense, but it was a different kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of rejection from the gallery owners and the critics anymore. I'd already lost their world, and I'd survived. This was a deeper, more vulnerable fear, the fear of exposing this raw, unguarded part of myself. This wasn't a performance, it was a piece of my soul sitting right there on the canvas. I decided to have a small show, not in a fancy gallery, but in a rented community space. I invited a few close friends, but I also put up a notice online, open to anyone. The night of the show, I was terrified. I felt naked. People moved through the room quietly. I watched their faces. I saw them not just looking at the art, but feeling it. I saw one woman stop in front of a piece made of layered, torn paper and charred wood. She didn't say anything, she just stood there for a long time, and then she touched her own chest lightly, as if checking for a heartbeat. Another person, a man I'd never met, came up to me. His eyes were re-dimmed. He said, "I lost my brother last year. This feels like that." Thank you. That connection, that raw human recognition, was worth more than any glowing review I'd ever received. That's when I understood the redefinition of success. It wasn't measured in sales or prestige. It was measured in the truth of the expression, and its ability to resonate with another human being's truth. Success was the quiet acknowledgement that someone else felt less alone because of something I made. And that final realization settled over me in the days that followed, as clear and as solid as the first handprint I'd made on that board. They took everything, the life I had built, the security, the identity I thought was mine. They took it all, but the one thing they couldn't take, the thing that was so buried under all that rubble that it was protected, was the ability to create. Not the ability to produce product, but the fundamental human urge to make meaning out of chaos. And in the end, that didn't just become something, it became everything. It was the thread that led me out of the wilderness. The blank canvas wasn't a thread of emptiness anymore. It was a promise of a new beginning, a chance to use my true voice, however rough or unpolished it might be, and for the first time that voice felt entirely, completely my own. The bathroom light was unforgiving. It was that harsh white light that shows every flaw, every crack. I had to lean heavily on the sink just to stand there, my knuckles white, my arms trembling with the simple effort of holding myself up. I finally forced myself to look, and I didn't recognize the person staring back. Right there in the middle of all that noise and celebration, her voice started to tremble. But beneath the tremor, it was firm, solid as iron. Her eyes, which had been so distant, were now locked on mine, and they were glassy with tears she was fiercely refusing to shed. She took a small step forward, and the crowd instinctively parted around us, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. And then she said it. The words were quiet, but they cut through the party chaos with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "You're just a cowardly." The eyes were mine, but they were sunken, ringed with dark circles. The hair was lank and dull. But it was the skin that got me. It had this pale, almost waxy quality, like something that had been left in a basement for too long. There was no vitality there, no life. It was a corpse of a former self. I remember a doctor's appointment a week before, the way he said general physical decline. With a detached sympathy, he mentioned depression, stressed the toll of grief. But hearing it and seeing it are two different things. That reflection was the proof. My mind had been a storm of despair for months, a year maybe, and it had written its misery all over my body. The weakness in my limbs, the tightness in my chest, the constant low-grade ache in my back. It wasn't just age, it was the physical manifestation of giving up. And in that moment, a bizarrely clear thought cut through the fog. If my mind had torn this down, then maybe my body could build it back up, not through thinking, not through talking, but through doing. The mind was too slippery, too prone to lies and loops. But the body deals in concrete facts. You can lift a weight, or you can't. You can run a mile, or you can't. There's no ambiguity. This weak, trembling shell would have to become the primary tool for my own reconstruction. It was the only material I had to work with. The first day at the gym was pure humiliation. I chose a time when I thought it would be empty, but of course it wasn't. I stood by the simple machines, utterly lost. I tried a leg press with just the weight of the sled itself. My legs shook so violently, I thought the muscle would peel away from the bone. I couldn't do a single push-up, not one, not even from my knees. I lay on the mat, face down, the rough carpet smell filling my nose, and I just breathed. The sheer agony wasn't just physical, it was the agony. Confronting how far I had fallen, every muscle fiber screamed in protest, a chorus of neglect. But something shifted that first week. The burning in my lungs, after a minute on the treadmill, the deep ache in my muscles the next morning. I started to see it not as punishment, but as a signal, a sign that something was happening. The burn meant I was pushing past a limit. The ache meant the fibers were repairing, getting stronger. I learned to welcome it, to seek it out. It was a clean pain, an honest pain, not like the vague, gnawing pain of sadness. This pain had a purpose. And then there was the food. My kitchen had been a monument to comfort eating, processed food, sugar, anything to give a fleeting hit of dopamine. I cleared it all out. It felt violent, like throwing out crutches I still thought I needed. I stood in the grocery store and read labels. For the first time I bought lean proteins, complex carbohydrates, green vegetables that I had to learn how to cook. Eating became purposeful. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about fuel. This protein would help repair the muscle I tore at the gym. These carbohydrates would give me the energy for tomorrow's run. It was mechanical, almost clinical, and that's what I needed. The early wins were tiny, but they were everything. The first night I slept through the night, a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke up feeling like a human being. I had more energy, not a frantic, caffeine-fueled energy, but a calm, steady current. And then one morning, about a month in, I was washing my hands, and I saw a faint shadow on my shoulder, a line of definition that hadn't been there before. A muscle. It was the smallest thing, but I stared at it. It was proof, tangible, visible proof, that effort could yield change. It was the first brick laid in a new foundation. Full, each word was deliberate, weighted, and landed with a physical impact I could feel in my chest. The routine itself became my sanctuary. The 5:30 a.m. alarm wasn't a torment after a while. It was a summons. The world was dark and quiet. The streets were empty on my run. The gym at that hour was populated by a few other quiet souls, all of us there for our own private reasons. We'd nod, but never speak. It was a silent communion. That hour, whether I was running on the path or lifting weights, became a form of moving meditation. There was no room for the chaotic thoughts. My mind would go quiet, focused entirely on the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement, or the count of reps, the feeling of the bar in my hands. The internal noise was replaced by a single pointed focus. The discipline of showing up, rain or shine, whether I felt like it or not, built a framework around my days. My life, which had felt shapeless and chaotic, now had a spine. I started setting goals, small, measurable, undeniable goals. My first goal was to run a full mile without stopping. The day I did it, I almost cried, leaning over with my hands on my knees, gasping for air, but with a fierce grin on my face. Then it was a pull-up. I worked for weeks with resistance bands, my body fighting me every inch of the way. The day I finally pulled my chin over that bar unassisted, I let out a sound that was half sob, half triumphant shout. Each goal achieved was a vote of confidence I cast. For myself, I was proving to myself that I could keep promises to me. This physical discipline began to bleed into everything else. The mental clarity was the most surprising part. The fog that had clouded my thinking for so long began to lift. Problems that would have sent me into a tailspin of anxiety now felt manageable. I could break them down into steps much like I broke down a workout. I had more patience, I had more resilience if I failed to lift a weight. I didn't spiral into self-hatred. I just thought, okay, try again. Next time that attitude started to apply to life, a setback at work, okay, assess, adjust, try again. The connection was undeniable. Each time I pushed my body past a point of discomfort, I was teaching my mind that it too could endure hardship. The physical strength and the inner strength were braiding together, each strand making the whole rope stronger. A year later, the transformation was undeniable. It wasn't just about the muscle definition or the fact that my clothes fit differently. It was in the way I carried myself. My posture was straight, my shoulders back, not hunched in a protective shell. I looked people in the eye. My gaze was steady. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. And the confidence wasn't an act, it was earned. It was the confidence of knowing what I was capable of enduring. This newfound physical capability began to mirror my ability to handle life's challenges. A difficult conversation that would have paralyzed the old me was now just another obstacle to be navigated with calm strength. A personal loss still hurt, but it didn't destroy me. I had built a vessel sturdy enough to contain the grief without sinking. I had faced the daily suffering of growth in the gym, and it had inoculated me against the larger sufferings of life. I started noticing others who were where I had been, the hesitant person, lingering by the gym entrance, a friend mentioning they felt stuck. I found myself offering quiet advice, not as an expert, but as a guide who knew the path. I became a source of inspiration, simply by being living proof that change was possible. It added a deeper purpose to the whole journey. It wasn't just about me anymore. The ultimate lesson, the one that settled deep into my bones, was this revelation that the body isn't a prison. The old me saw it as a trap, the source of my limitations and my pain. But I had it backwards. The body is the vehicle, it's the instrument. It's through this physical form that we experience the world, that we enact our will. By forging it in the fire of discipline, by strengthening its every part, I wasn't just building a better body, I was building a better life. I was assembling the very tool I needed